welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today's show is going to be a little bit different, everyone, from what I usually do here. Obviously, most weeks I'm talking about trauma and our relationships, the community, and psychology that shapes all of our daily lives. Today, I'm going to step back a little bit and look at a bigger climate that we're actually living in and how it's actually starting to spill into our lifestyle and BDSM communities. Now, before I get into all of this today and the heart of this, I want to pause for a moment. I want to say thank you again, as I always do, to all of my new listeners. And for those of you who've been here from the very beginning, 4 years in, you're going to be heading towards year 5. This podcast continues to grow because you tune in, you share it, you bring these conversations into your own lives, into people you care about. So if you find value in what I'm doing, do me a favor. Please take a moment to follow, rate the show 5 stars if you follow me on Spotify, and subscribe on YouTube. It does make a difference. And if you'd like to go a step further in supporting the work that I do, there is a donation link on the show's description. That support helps me keep creating the kinds of conversation I think our community really needs. All right. So, in the wider world right now, rhetoric is starting to get harsher. Violence is showing up more often, and simply disagreeing with someone has started to feel like justification for exclusion or even harm. And I've been watching that same energy bleed into our kink spaces, arguments over who's real or who's allowed in and who should be shut down or silenced. That's the opposite of what kink is supposed to be about. At its best, this community stands for freedom and consent, imagination, erotic exploration, and the ability to express ourselves without fear. When we lose that, we lose the foundation that keeps us safe and creative. So today I'm going to go into a few of these concepts, and I'm going to talk about these things because I think in what's going on with recent events, how this is spilling over. I want to talk about some origins today, things that, I think that matter. And I'm not going to lie to you. I'm nervous even doing this because I don't want people then to say, they don't agree with me and then I suffer for it. I think we should all have our views and then be able to move forward. Now, the first thing I want to get into today is what I call the psychology of groupthink in kink. So when I talk about groupthink, I'm not just pulling out this whole psychological textbook term here. Groupthink is the process where the need for belonging, agreement, and approval overrides our critical thinking. People start nodding along, and even if they don't agree, because the cost of standing out feels too high. We usually hear about groupthink in politics or in history. You think about governments or movements or even corporations that made terrible decisions because nobody wants to be the one to speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. But the truth is, groupthink is just as alive in our kink communities, and it might not look like a government committee, but the mechanics are exactly the same. Now, one way it shows up is through exclusionary calls. And that message of people like you don't belong here. I've seen posts that flat out declare that conservatives shouldn't be allowed in kink or queer spaces. Now, whether you agree with someone's politics or not, when we start drawing lines like that, it starts being about behavior. It stops being about behavior and it starts being about identity. The specifics change. Sometimes it's aimed at newcomers, sometimes at people who don't fit a particular mold of maybe a real dominant or a real submissive. But the psychology here is constant. Once someone defines who is in and who is out, the group lines harden. And when those lines harden, it doesn't matter how respectful, how curious, or creative an individual is. If they're in the out camp, their voice is completely silenced. And that's the heart of groupthink, conformity over creativity. And people stop paying attention to anything. They stop saying what they actually believe because they fear being shamed or excluded, sometimes even being attacked. And that silence spreads. Now, instead of a room full of different voices and perspectives, you get a room where everyone parrots the same safe, accepted lines. And this is toxic for the kink community. This is toxic for communities in a greater sense. BDSM relies on our difference. It thrives when people bring their quirks, their particular edges, their unusual fantasies into the open. Now, if everyone in a dungeon or a munch or even online thread feels like they have to toe the same line, what happens? Creativity here collapses. People retreat into private corners, or worse, they walk away altogether. That kind of conformity doesn't make communities safer, it makes them brittle. Now, let's take this down to the individual level. In groupthink, we often see people ignore their gut instincts to avoid conflict. In psychology, that's what we call cognitive dissonance. That whole tension between what you believe inside and what you feel forced to go along with on the outside. In kink, ignoring that tension can be especially dangerous. Why? If you're afraid to speak up about a limit because the group or your partner has framed you as wrong or weak, you're not only betraying yourself, you're setting the stage for harm. Now, this is where originality comes in. Groupthink doesn't just silence opinions, it strips away individuality. The very quirks, the creative sparks that make kink vibrant get muted because here the price of standing out feels too high. Now, over time, people stop experimenting, they stop speaking up, they stop creating. And the group's going to look united, but actually it's really stagnant, right? We've seen this when people go off on their own, they want to formulate their own communities, and then they try, and then they go there, and nothing has changed. It's just the same constant discussion over and over. They get bored, and then they can return back. So when someone says, people like you don't belong here, we need to recognize what's really happening. It's not just about one person venting. It's the beginning of a group dynamic that tells everyone else, stay in line or you're going to be next. Now, that's not only the death of consent and safety, right? It's the slow death of originality itself. BDSM was built on people daring to step outside of the mainstream. Now, if we punish the difference inside of our own walls, we become the very culture that once pushed us out. And I want to be clear here. When people talk to me about the origins of BDSM and kink and all of these things, and they say, this certain community created it or not, we need to look at actually history here. Now, if you actually go back to the times before, I don't know, the hundreds, thousands of years ago, so you're going back before Christ, right? There was a person, he was a Roman named Ovid, right? And I'm going to mispronounce this, but that's okay. You can look this up. It's called the Ars Amatoria and Amores. These were erotic poems created back, and it did talk about in there some of the hierarchy, some of the power play, some of the dynamics between men and women, and how these were explored. And if you start looking throughout history, you see more and more of it. It's not just a secular, view. You can go back into the 1800s of Aubrey Beardsley. He was around near the times of Oscar Wilde and his erotic art and his paintings. You can look at Anais Nin, right? So in the early 1900s was writing very sexual awakenings. All of these things were long mainstream. Marquis de Sade, this is literally where we got sadism. And from somebody else, we got the origins of masochism. Now, all of these things have been around human history. Erotic desire has been around human history since the beginning. We've been curious. We've been wondering. Now, I will say I'm not canceling anybody out. What I am saying is, yes, the gay community, the leather community, the after World War II definitely, made this more of an institution. They definitely modernized a lot of these things. Wonderful. They brought in the dungeons and clubs. And if you also look back in our history, in 1971, there was I'm going to mispronounce this a little bit, but the Jugendspiel Society, the TES, and they were formed in 1971 out of New York. They were more based in a heterosexual and pansexual way, but they were predominant fighters for the LGBT. They took part in marches, or the LGB at the time took part in marches in New York and across the country. So the origins are there for everybody. It's just not just specific to one group, right? But this is where The rhetoric has now starting, especially after recent events, has turned violent. BDSM lives and dies on language, right? We negotiate, we talk about our limits, aftercare, all of it starts with words. When the words in our communities change, the culture changes with them. That's why rhetoric matters. Disagreement is normal, and disagreement is even healthy. It's how people learn. We test ideas, we negotiate, we reject, we grow. Lately, though, more of these disagreements have taken a sharper turn. Instead of, saying, hey, I don't see it that way, the tone now becomes people like you don't belong here. I don't want you here. Get out. Right? And once that door is open, it does not take long for someone to push it further, mocking, threatening, or even celebrating the idea of harm. And here's the kind of thing I mean without names. I've seen posts that have said, this one group doesn't belong in our kink spaces, and another that went much darker, where the writer described a feeling of being aroused by the thought of people being killed. I'm not going to repeat the graphic language because I'm not going to give that a platform. And the point what I'm looking at, we're looking at the pattern. Disagreement slides into exclusion. Exclusion becomes dehumanization, and dehumanization becomes a license for cruelty, even if it's only fantasized. The turn from dialogue to punishment mirrors the same breakdown we see outside of our community. It stops being about negotiating differences and becomes about enforcing conformity through fear. And in kink, that's deadly to trust. Trust is what, lets people speak a limit, change a scene on the fly, or ask for aftercare that feels silly to them, especially if they're wanting to negotiate it. But if people start to believe that the cost of speaking is social pain, they're going to stop speaking altogether, right? Now, here's the twist worth naming. The people who shout the loudest about oppression or exclusion can slip into doing the very same thing. In trying to silence what they dislike, they recreate the dynamic they say they're fighting. That's how a community prides itself on safety that drifts towards coercion without noticing, even authoritarianism. Once threats, even casual ones, show up in the room, honesty is punished. People hold back concerns because they don't want to be labeled. They avoid asking clarifying questions because they don't want to look unsafe. And the more that happens, the more consent becomes guesswork. And guesswork is not consent. Kink is not supposed to mirror politics at its worst. If everybody keeps telling me kink is political, kink is not about coercing people into an approved view. It's about building a space where negotiation is possible, where differences are workable, and where respect sets the ground, especially the ground rules, even when there's no chemistry, right? That's why the language we use matters so much. Every time we reach for threats, if we celebratory talk about harm or blanket bans on the broad identities, we're setting a tone. And that tone tells people that we're speaking, that whatever they're going to say carries a risk. And the alternative is simple and hard. Keep critique on ideas and behaviors, not identity. Ask a question before assuming intent. If a topic is high voltage, get consent to discuss it and accept a no. Call out clear targets for removal when there are real threats, doxing or stalking. And don't, widen the net to catch unpopular views. Teach by example that disagreement does not equal disrespect. A few weeks ago, if you remember, I took my voice back because somebody decided to dox me and they thought it was okay. That's not okay. But because they disagreed with what I was saying, they took it to another level. That caused a real world effect for me, that caused real world harm. So when rhetoric creeps towards harm, it's not just about bad manners, it signals a cultural shift. If we let that stand, it erodes everything kink is meant to protect: consent, creativity, and dignity. So let's talk about why silence is dangerous, right? Silencing feels efficient. If we remove the upsetting voice, we remove the discomfort. The problem is that that it trains everyone's nervous system to expect punishment for speaking. And once that lesson lands, curiosity shuts down, honesty dries up, and people start only saying what sounds safe. That is the beginning of authoritarian thinking in any setting, large or small. And that same logic justifies suppressing a political opponent is the logic that justifies shaming a newcomer at a munch for having the wrong view or background. It's the same move on a different scale. Now, when people fear social pain, they conform. Most of us would rather avoid the heat than risk exile. So when we watch which opinions get applause, which ones get piled on, and we adjust, this creates the illusion that everyone agrees. In reality, many are holding back, waiting for permission to be honest. That is how an apparent consensus forms, not because many minds changed, but because many mouths closed. The cost is real. Honest limits go unspoken. Real concerns about safety are kept private. And play gets flatter, it gets more narrow, more predictable. Silencing also feeds shame. If the group signals that certain questions, histories, or identities are unwelcome, people start to believe there is something wrong with them for even having the thought. Shame makes us hide, and hiding blocks the kind of negotiation kink requires. You cannot negotiate what you're afraid to name. And once people stop naming, consent becomes guesswork, like I said before, and guesswork is not consent. There is another trap. Once a group defines itself by what it is not, it begins to police purity. The target shift over time. First, it's the outsiders. Then it's the insiders who are not pure enough. Old guard can do it to the new guard, and the new guard can do it to the old guard. Progressive circles can silence in the name of safety. Conservative circles can silence in the name of tradition. Silence doesn't belong to one side. It shows up in progressive circles and conservative circles alike. The banners change, but sometimes it's framed as safety and sometimes as tradition, but the mechanism is the same. A group decides what's acceptable, and anyone outside of that line is pressured to conform or stay quiet. If we only see it in the other side, we miss how easily the same pattern grows in our own spaces, right? Rhetoric that justifies silencing often claims to protect the vulnerable. Sometimes protection is truly needed, I will agree, but for example, when there are credible threats like the doxing and the stalking or targeted harassment, clear removal definitely is appropriate in those cases. The danger is when the net is widened to cover unpopular opinions, clumsy wording, or the wrong affiliation. That's how safety is, a safety policy becomes a loyalty test. Once that happens, people learn to posture instead of engage, and they perform the right view so they're not left alone. And then, I know I'm going to hear about, sorry, I'm not feeling well today. Got a really wicked cough. I know I'm going to hear, oh, well, certain groups shouldn't say these things. Absolutely. And there are things I do agree with. But I can't stop human nature. I don't have to side with those people. And I don't have to conform or be around those people at all. I can choose who I want around. But then I have to remember what I'm also doing. So if we look at this in a different context, the solution is not to demand agreement. It's to design for good disagreement. Now, that starts with norms that everyone can understand and apply. Critique ideas, not people. Don't attach labels to a person's character. Ask a question before you assume their intent. If a topic is high voltage, request consent to ask access to discuss it, right? And accept a no. Use timeouts when a conversation is running hot. Give people the right to pass without penalty, and treat a misstep that's owned and repaired differently from a pattern of abuse. Reserve removal from targeted harm, not for difference. Leaders and moderators set the temperature. If they reward pile-ons, the room learns to punish. If they reward honest repair, the room learns to speak and listen. And a simple practice here helps. After a sharp disagreement, ask both sides to state the best version of the other person's point before replying. It slows the reflex to, from attacking and keeps it on the ideas that are being set forth. It also shows by example that disagreement doesn't equal disrespect. For individuals, there is a way through. You have to notice the moment in your body as it tightens. And, if you want to silence, take a breath, label what's happening inside of you, and decide if your next move is about protecting, that consent and dignity, or only protects your discomfort. If you're the one who feels silenced, you got to name the impact without name calling. Something like, when I hear people like you don't belong here, I feel unsafe to share. I want a community where we can disagree without threats. That is firm and clear, and it invites repair. I don't have to like every opinion. Nobody does. But we do have to keep a space where people are not afraid to speak. And kink depends on that freedom. Without it, our exploration dies, our trust is going to die, and the community is going to shrink into a performance of safety rather than the real thing. Now, silencing may feel like control in the short term, but the long-term cost? It's the loss of consent, creativity, and dignity, and that price, to me, is too high. Now, at its best, kink is not about hierarchy for hierarchy's sake, or control for the sake of control. It's about building trust strong enough to take risks together. That trust rests on the three foundations that I've said: consent, creativity, dignity. When we lose sight of these whole ideas that we brought us here in the first place, the whole structure is going to wobble. Consent is the anchor. Everything we do, from light bondage to edge play to DDLG, it all relies, even rope, relies on the freedom to say yes and the safety to say no. Without that freedom, kink is coercion, not choice. And here's the real catch: consent is not just about what happens in the scene. It's about the culture that surrounds it. If your community pressures people into silence or shames them for their views, or hints at a disagreement makes them dangerous, right? Then consent has already been a compromise before anyone ever ties a knot or lights a candle. A submissive who fears judgment for speaking limits is already silenced. A dominant who is mocked for asking questions will stop asking. And both situations erode the very conditions that make consent possible. And we know creativity here is the lifeblood of what we do. Kink has never thrived by following one script. It thrives because people bring their quirks, their oddities, their erotic fantasies that don't fit anywhere else. Every dungeon, every munch, every corner of social media is the patchwork of different ideas about what desire looks like. Creativity is what keeps the scene alive, that willingness to try, to play, to experiment, to imagine. But creativity cannot breathe under conformity. And when members worry about one wrong word here will brand them as an outsider, they censor themselves, they stay safe. But that safety is in the dullest sense. They stay safe by staying small. And that is not the soil in which new fantasies grow. And communities that slip into groupthink lose their edge, not because people run out of imagination, but because the imagination becomes too risky to share. Now, I want to be clear on something. I think a lot of people know my stance on the rope community. I give them a lot of grief. It's because it's not my kink, and that's fine. Recently, not recently, a few months ago, I saw somebody who did a wonderful tie, and it was very dramatic and obviously required a lot of skill. I have a lot of respect for this person. He's been on my show, and the person, I believe they're in some sort of dynamic, but I'm not going to go into that. It's not my place, not the point. They did this very complicated tie, very beautiful, very visceral. And long story short, it was like a hanging. Now, there was obviously months of negotiations and discussions that went around this, so much creativity. But what if somebody comes along and says they're not allowed to do that? Because it reminds me of something that happened in the US, right? So now you can't do that type of rope work anymore. Where are we going to start drawing the line? They're out because they decided to explore something new, something graphic, something daring, something dangerous. You're going to risk destroying their dignity. And dignity is the glue here. We don't have to like every opinion or every fetish or every style of play, but we do have to treat people as people. That means not reducing them to caricatures or enemies. Dignity is not about agreement, it's about refusing to dehumanize. Now, once a group feels justified in stripping dignity away from its opponents, the door is open to mockery, exclusion, and even cheering for harm. And at the moment we cheer for harm, we've betrayed the very principles that made kink a refuge in the first place. Remember, kink was built by people who were already excluded, already judged, already told they were too much, too strange, too different. And to repeat that same exclusion inside our own walls is to forget our history. Lately, with the escalation of rhetoric online, these principles feel under threat. The more conversations spiral into us versus them, the less space there is for trust, imagination, respect. The irony is that people often justify exclusion or harshness in the name of safety, but real safety doesn't come from silencing. It comes from boundaries clearly drawn, from dialogue that's openly held, and for communities strong enough to handle disagreement without fear. This past weekend, I was with a group, and we were going somewhere. Where doesn't matter because I'm not going to name them. I'm not going to name the place. But we were asked, what is my political affiliation? Before we were allowed to enter the dungeon. I was taken aback. My whole group was taken aback. And I said, I don't understand what this has to do with anything. We're just here because we want to pay and see the demo. But that wasn't why I could be there. I couldn't be there because of all of a sudden now my political identity. Well, I don't need to share that. And it's not really relevant. What I view is not why I'm here. What I think outside of here. It's literally why I'm in BDSM, because I'm trying to get away from all of this. I'm just here for my erotic self, for what I want to see, for what somebody else is going to maybe teach or show me. So when we heard that question and I asked if they were serious and they said yes, that we couldn't enter without saying, I said, thank you very much. And we left. Now, that's their very right to do so. But that was, I don't know, 16 of us that went somewhere else. And unfortunately, it kind of ruined our night and ruined our weekend. But ultimately, it led us to know that that's not going to be a place we're going to frequent anymore. Because we have that right. I don't have to go there. I wanted to. I really wanted to see the demo, but the way I view the world has nothing to do with why I was going there in the first place. But if that's how they want to do their thing, they're very entitled. Now, I didn't shame them. I didn't get angry, but I didn't go. Right? And the whole point of this, at its best, kink is supposed to show us a world, a different model, right? That you can play without abuse. You can engage in power dynamics. That you can explore extremes without losing respect. And that you can hold the difference without collapsing into division. That model is worth defending. And it starts with each of us remembering what kink truly stands for: consent over coercion, creativity over conformity, and dignity over dehumanization. Here's the call I have for all of you, especially since I've been working with a lot of people this week that have felt uneasy or I've answered a lot of these questions about unease. The truth is, we don't need to tear each other apart over our differences. We don't. Kink is never meant to be uniform. I'm not in the DDLG community. I don't do the, ABDL. I am not a sensual dom, right? I'm not into rope. So kink was never meant for us to be uniformed. It's a space that allows all of us to access something. It's meant to hold the people who didn't fit in the mainstream, the ones who were told they're too much, too strange, too complicated. It gave us a spot to explore those things. And the strength of our community came from the diversity, not from the conformity. And what we need now is to protect the space where diverse voices and practices can coexist. Now, some of you may already know the cost of silence in your own body. That knot in your stomach before you post, or the pause before you speak up at a munch, or the hesitation when you wonder if one wrong word could get you labeled. Even I've experienced that. I experience that now because I don't know how this is going to land, right? That unease isn't just personal, it's cultural. And if too many of us feel it, silence is going to become the normal thing. And that doesn't mean every idea is equally wise or that boundaries don't matter. It doesn't mean, or it does mean that we commit to keep, the conversation open, even when we bristle at what somebody says. It means pausing long enough to listen, correcting when needed, but not shutting people down for simply seeing the world differently than you do. Disagreement should not mean silencing. It should not mean exclusion, and it should never be, lead to violence. And that's, whether that violence is of words or violence of actions, none of it's going to be okay. Because the moment we allow fear to rule our speech, we trade consent for coercion. And without consent, kink is going to lose every foundation we have. And then when we stop talking, the real harm's going to begin. It may not be war with the traditional sense, but in our world, it looks like silence turning into ignorance, and ignorance turning into mistakes, and mistakes turning into real damage. If newcomers can't ask questions without fear, they don't just stay silent, they stay uneducated. And when education dies, safety dies with it. So the question I want to leave you all today with is, what kind of community do you want to help build? One that punishes difference, or one that's strong enough to hold it without falling apart? Because if we lose the courage to speak openly in kink, we lose the heart of kink itself. The courage to say yes, to say no, to try something new, to admit what scares us. That courage only survives if we make space for it together. I know this is a heavy conversation. And I've wrestled with talking about getting as close to politics as possible because it's not for me. I don't like discussing how I view the world. I don't do that in my work, and I don't like to do it here because I don't have an agenda. I have no agenda. There's a reason I put my work before me. Where others on social media make it about them, because if I make stuff about me, it's not about my work. And I always wanted to be about the work, or I wanted to be about the discussion, because I want you all to think. Even if I don't agree, I at least want to hear why. But we use words, we say things, and all we do is make labels, and we don't even understand the context of the things that we're saying, or we take things out of character, or we take things out of context. We cherry pick phrases to bolster arguments, and we don't even care if we're wrong anymore. We just don't care. And all we're saying now is, you don't belong here. You're not kinky enough. You're not leather enough. You're not community enough. And you're out. And I'm not going to get into individual, examples. Yes, of course, there are problematic individuals that, they don't learn, or they can't learn, or they're incapable of learning and consistently cause harm. They shouldn't be a part of the community. I agree, but that's not what I'm talking about. So don't do what I'm exactly saying and try to cherry pick everything apart. Look at the broader context here and the ramifications of what's starting to happen. Because I can tell you, a lot of people are worried about going back into spaces. A lot of people are worried about being judged just because the way, they have a view. For the same rights that you want, the same views you want, how come you are the only one? And I don't care what side you're on. How can you be the only one to have a view and no one else is allowed to have a view? Because if you don't know what authoritarian rule is, you need to open up a book. You need to understand definitions. Because the very thing that anybody, either side, any side, is advocating for is exactly that. And that's not a community I'm going to be a part of. Doesn't mean I'm going to leave. It's just going to mean that my styles will remain where they are with the people I care about the most. Because at least there we can have open discussions about things, and we're not worried that somebody's going to be offended or want to cancel us, or worse. That's why we do it. So I'm not going to, this week, I'm not going to do You're Famous Now. I could, I want to, but this isn't a week for that, right? For all that negativity and hate that I've definitely received a lot more of lately. I'm not going to go into that this week. I do want to answer a question I did get. as somebody's been asking me lately, have I been considering another book? First, actually, he told me to stop shaming my first book. So, yes, I do have a book out. It's called Tangled Desires, the intersection between psychology and BDSM. Wherever you get your books at, you can buy it on your Kindle or a paperback. After some long contemplation, yes, I'm actually considering something new. I don't know on what yet, but we'll see. Writing a book is different than writing 500 or 1,000 words on a post about psychology and our emotions and BDSM. It's far different. But we'll see. I'll see what permeates maybe over Christmas time when I take some weeks off and I have some time to contemplate myself. Maybe some origins, maybe an origin book of what's inspired so many people, so we can maybe have some more history context. Because if we want to learn, if we want to actually say we're a community, I think we need to start understanding it didn't just start in the 1960s. It's been around for thousands of years. And we need to just stop saying it was created by one person. I'm not saying people didn't make it institutionalized and frameworked it and really brought it to the next level, but we need to understand it's been around a lot longer. That eroticism has always been there, that exploration and power dynamics have always been there. We just can't be so myopic in our views that anybody who sees something different, that they just become a target of hate. It's not going to work. And I can tell you right now, I'll stop helping. And there's a lot of groups I've cut off. I'm not going to associate with it. And there are people that I do understand that I've ended things or contacts with because there are some things I just can't agree with. And I don't agree with certain things. And that's okay. We can have differences and we can just walk away and be different. We can be different people. But there's just nothing wrong with that. If we are going to be allowed to have our views and allowed to believe in the things that we want, we have to be allowed to have our differences. But if we're not going to agree on our differences, then I don't know what to tell you. You're going to end up in a world really small with 2 or 3 people, and it's going to eventually go from 3 people down to 2, and then eventually it's going to be a fight because eventually one person is going to say, I have a different idea, and that's going to say, oh, well, we have these rules. You're not allowed to go against that. And then you're going to be down by yourself. Because that's what happens eventually in groupthink. It's modeled throughout history. We have to consider all of these things. I'm not preaching because I think I know better, but I do read a lot. And I love this community. I've been a part of it for a long time. And now I help it in another fashion. So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts today. I know this is a big subject. Please do not draw in outside things that you think I'm talking about. That's not what it's here. If there are going to be negative comments, if there are going to be any detrimental things, I am not going to engage. I'm not. I am open for debate, but there is not going to be hostility. I don't want to see people fighting with each other. A healthy discussion is one thing, but no more name calling. No more name calling. And I'm going to be very clear on something on my boundaries. Years ago, when I really started to get more formidable on social media, there was somebody I looked up to that would never respond to certain comments, and it always kind of confused me. And would just stipulate, hey, I'm going to delete or block you. And I kind of like was questioning that. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of concerning. Why would you do that? But I honestly get it now, because you can't engage with fueled blind rage and hate. You just can't do it. So I'm not going to do it anymore. And I don't also want to see, I'm not asking you to conform with what I'm saying. Healthy disagreement is fine. I'm fine with that. No name calling, no nothing. If that happens, comments are going to get deleted. This is no longer going to be, this has never been about that. And people think I do that. I don't do that. By the time I have to remove a comment, is it because you're just moving into insults or threats, or I'm not going to engage with that. Right. And it is taxing, not only on me, but others. And I'm not going to do it anymore. So please understand that. Okay. So let me know what you think about today. This whole thing in general, experiences. If you don't feel like it, you want to send me a private message, you can email me as well. Right. So I want to welcome a very new listener from the UK, from London. Thank you for your lovely message. I appreciate it. Right. If All of these people, I hear you, I listen to you, I respond to all of you. I do the best I can to respond to all of you. Thousands of comments a month. I really do my best. And for a lot of you, you don't know that's really difficult to do because, I'm not on here 24/7, right? But I do hear you and I do see you all and I do try to do the best I can. With that said, until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.